Thank you very much. Good evening, Mayor Henderson and members of council. This evening, we're going to focus on the general fund. You'll recall that we have a second work session scheduled for tomorrow evening at 6, at which time our plan is to review the various enterprise funds, and hopefully, but my expectation that those reviews and presentations will be more succinct than the treatment that the general fund gets, and that we'll have an opportunity perhaps to ask questions and discuss the information you hear this evening regarding the general fund. And then tomorrow evening as well, we'll ask the council to confirm the dates for the public hearings associated with the budget. Those are the tax rate and fee public hearings, and then the public hearing on the expenditure and the budget in totality. On the 12th, this coming Monday, or a week from this evening, there's a public hearing on the general reassessment, which obviously has direct relevance to the budget. But that public hearing is simply for the council to receive public comment, feedback on the general reassessment. There's no subsequent specific action that the council will be asked to take regarding the general reassessment. I'm going to make some introductory remarks and then hand it off to Mr. Shaw and Mr. McCormick, who will provide more specific detail and insight into the general fund. And so this evening, I'd like to begin by posing two questions. What does it mean to be a city, and what kind of city do you mean to be? Maybe a third question would be, what do I mean by posing such mean questions? Shouldn't a budget presentation answer more questions than it raises? It probably should. But the first question, what does it mean to be a city, is relevant because some of the key budget influencers this year, and likely in future years, are external obligations that are inherent responsibilities of municipalities in the Commonwealth structure of government. I'm referring to public schools, correction and detention, public health, mental health, and other services vital to our communities, which the city has an obligation to support financially by code or formal agreement. The second question, what kind of city do you mean to be, refers to the choices that leaders make that have enduring impact on the community or the municipal organization, and most especially choices about revenue and expenditures. The answer to the first question provides context and explains, among other things, why revenues don't seem to go as far as they seem they should. The second question must really be confirmed by the council and speaks to the overall quality of life in its broadest sense. The challenge for decision makers is balancing the need for sufficient revenue to provide essential, core, and desirable municipal services, programs, and facilities. Balancing those needs with the specific tax and fee obligations borne by families and businesses. It is a question of what product and of what quality is being provided by the local government and at what price point. It is balancing service and affordability. That challenge becomes more complex when one considers the significant local government obligations to external agencies, previously referenced, providing public education, public health, mental health, substance use services, correction, detention, and social services, all regarded as essential public services for which the city bears financial responsibility in partnership with other local governments and or the Commonwealth. Being a municipality in the Commonwealth is as much about these obligations as it is those essential core and preferred services over which local elected and professional leaders carry more direct influence and which are more commonly viewed by constituents as local services. It is about the reality that the local government's tax authority must necessarily be used to support these various external agencies which themselves do not have the authority to tax. As we consider the 2022 recommended budget, economic activity remains better than originally forecasted in anticipation of the public health emergency, and associated tax and license revenues reflect as much. With the conspicuous exception of real estate taxes, revenue forecasts for fiscal 2022 are more in line with actual revenues realized in 2020. There are expenditure and budget elements that are important and worthy of note. The budget provides for a 3% merit opportunity. The city will absorb the anticipated 10% increase in health insurance premium expense. And the budget provides a $944,000 reserve specifically for the West End Fire Station. The budget includes significant increases for support of public education, correction, and detention. The merit opportunity is valuable for employees, however, it is more properly regarded as a maintenance adjustment. The budget does not contain funds for implementation of even the initial phases of the pay and classification study, reflecting a second year of delayed implementation. The reserve for the West End Fire Station reflects progress on a stated goal, but that is the extent of progress on council-established priorities. With the conspicuous and important exception of real property taxes, local revenues are generally flat. In that revenue environment, meaningful progress on council's priorities cannot be achieved. Simply put, the recommended budget enables the city to meet its debt obligation, meet obligations to external entities such as the local school system, regional jail, and Department of Social Services, continue generally levels of service that remain much as they exist today, and provide employees the well-deserved 3% wage increase. With the exception of some entry-level positions in the police department, there is no progress in adjusting employee compensation to the market, nor is there headway on the city's capital improvement plan. In my view, we will continue to fall short of meeting some of the basic service demands in core services. Over time, in such a constrained revenue environment, one can expect increasing focus on essential services of public safety, public works, and public education, and simultaneously declining progress and emphasis on discretionary or non-essential services, programs, and facilities. I referenced earlier the real estate tax. Despite economic turmoil created by the coronavirus pandemic, real estate sales, especially in the housing market, have remained robust, which drives prices and, in turn, assessment values. And according to the laws of the Commonwealth, the local real estate assessments must reflect the market. Real estate property or real property taxes are notoriously unpopular, yet they remain the single most important source of revenue for local governments, mostly because they are stable and less vulnerable, though not entirely immune to larger economic forces than other sources of revenue. This is a general reassessment year for our community in which the market for real property is evaluated and new values are assigned to properties for purpose of taxation. The data indicates that the real estate market is healthy, and some might even say hot. This also means that the taxpayers will bear a higher tax burden. In normal times, the new revenue from a general reassessment would provide a boost in the form of durable revenue growth, creating capacity to achieve progress on priorities established by the council for the benefit of the community. The new revenue provided by this reassessment, however, is especially important to repair and restore sound financial footing for the municipal organization following the exceptional measures implemented last year in the context of the pandemic. Those new revenues are vital to meeting obligations to public education and correction, and preventing further erosion of the city's position in the labor market. Absent regular and meaningful revenue growth, the municipal organization will remain focused on essential services to the detriment of core and discretionary services, programs, and facilities. There are 38 cities in the Commonwealth. 30 have higher real estate tax and 2 tax rates than Waynesboro, and 2 have the same real estate tax rate as Waynesboro. Only 6 have lower rates, and in virtually all of those communities, one can point to either significantly higher taxable values, exceptional revenues from other sources, or lower service demands. Through 2020, the average real estate tax rate among Virginia cities is $1.06 per $100 of taxable value. Obviously, that's 16 cents higher than Waynesboro's 90-cent real estate tax rate. Similarly, utility rates and fees compare favorably to other municipal and water and wastewater providers. The cities comparably affordable market position comes largely by suppressed labor expense. We have confirmed through study that wage and salary rates for city employees are below market. We know also that requests for additional staff in public safety departments have consistently been unfunded in the city manager's recommended budgets. Additionally, durable revenue growth is essential for capital investment, repair, and maintenance to sustain valuable facilities such as bridges, pools, playgrounds, roads, buildings, and utility infrastructure. The costs of operating local government are not immune from inflation or increase, and the demand for most governmental service is inflexible, meaning it does not change with economic downturn. The recommended budget for 2022 balances at $54.5 million, actually slightly more than $54.5 million. Revenue forecasts are based on a real property tax rate of 90 cents. There are no recommended increases or changes otherwise in tax rates, fees, or charges that support services in the general fund. Mr. Shaw and Mr. McCormick will provide additional insight into the detail into the general fund budget. Tomorrow evening, we'll present and review the enterprise funds, schedule public hearings, and consider next steps in review of presented material. Cameron, if you can advance to the first slide of the presentation.
Oh, Jim, you're muted.
Thank you, Mr. Short. Mr. Mayor, members of council, good evening. So you should have received a copy of the city manager's budget in PDF form and the invitation to this Zoom. And if you'd like to have a paper copy, then certainly we can provide that to you. So this is not the easiest budget to present for a couple of reasons. That typically, when we try to explain a budget, we can look at what are the significant revenues and expenditures that drive the budget, and then how are they changed, especially if you're familiar with, viewing previous budgets. What are the significant changes? And this budget is unusual because of the number of things that we had to do in response to coronavirus and our concerns about the economic downturn that would come along with the global pandemic. So as we look at it, we really are going to be talking a lot of times about three budget cycles, and that would be the 2020 budget that was completed at the end of June of 2020, and for which we know what those revenues and expenditures are. Those are real numbers, and typically when we're doing especially revenue projections, that we're either basing it on a known quantity like personal property values or real estate values, those kinds of things, or we're trending from some previous period. And so those numbers are important in trying to do a lot of those trend lines. But then, it's also important to remember what we did to be able to balance the 2021 budget. And there are going to be times that, that comparison is relevant, especially in terms of expenditures. But it's also important to recall that there were things that we did to balance the 2021 budget that I think we were clear would be things that either would be difficult to replicate, repeat, year after year, or that we simply wouldn't recommend. They were not things that would create a sustainable financial position over time for a locality. And then obviously we're talking now about the 2022 budget. So it's, again, usually we can compare the current budget to the proposed budget, but in this case, at least for assembling the budget, and I think in trying to understand the budget, you really have to have a trend over a longer period of time. In some ways, as we looked at, the as we were assembling the 2021 budget, the budget year that we're currently in, we were going into a global pandemic, and we were, had been looking back at a prior year that had, about a quarter of the year impacted by the global pandemic. The downturn started in the final quarter of fiscal year 2021, or 2020 rather. Our hope would be that as we look to 2022, that we're going to start to see some recovery, especially in revenues like the meals tax. And so we if we're being optimistic, we would assume that in some ways it will be sort of a bookend, and that you'll start out the first quarter especially impacted by coronavirus downturn, and then hopefully as the year progresses, we would see some recovery. So tonight we'll work through, remind ourselves of budget retreat priorities. We will talk a bit about just a refresher on those things that we did, to respond to the impact of COVID-19 in the current year budget, and then go through a revenue and expenditure overview, some discussion about the use of fund balance in the current budget, and then talk a bit about next steps. I know you're obviously familiar with the retreat priorities that we outlined back in November of 2020, and as I think we've predicted in the last 3 budget work sessions, this budget really fails to make a lot of progress on your priorities. That we do have a 3% wage increase included for a merit increase included for employees, but as Mr. Hamp has mentioned, it really doesn't make progress on the wage compensation study recommendations from a year ago or so, that were that first phase of the comp study would move folks to at least into their market range, and then the next phase would capture anybody that was more than 10% out of the market, and then and those, at least last year, that was our hope, was to at least accomplish those 2 things. The compensation study, of course, has recommendations that would bring everyone to market. We will, at least in this budget, we hope to set aside some money in the capital plan for West End Fire Station, not enough necessarily to construct the project, at least not at a $2 million budget. But a lot of that is basically reshuffling money that's already in the CIP or in fund balance. We're not devoting new revenue to that effort, and then at this point, we're not making progress on Sunset Park or some of the other things that are listed in your priorities. As Mr. Hamp has mentioned, the fiscal year proposed, the FY22 proposed budget is a bit more than $54.5 million, which represents a 7.6% increase over the existing year budget, FY21. And as I say, I think we look at FY21 as being somewhat artificially suppressed, especially as we see the revenues have not done as poorly as we would have expected, and also suppressed because there were certain things that were done in order to try to reduce expenditures in the FY21 budget. We had furloughs built in for employees. We didn't provide full support to the schools according to the funding formula, and some other items that we can cover in a little more detail. Last year, about early March, we were pretty well on our way to completing a proposed budget for FY21. And I think there was some optimism about that budget. I think we were making progress in terms of capital improvement planning and in terms of employee wages and, a number of the things that were council priorities. And then, of course, the pandemic came along. And so we had to quickly adjust and scramble and, to be able to do that, we projected what our revenue losses would be. And, we had some experience from the 2009 recession to try to predict what those kind of drops would be. We were also looking to other resources. There were folks throughout the Commonwealth who were going through the same experience and providing BML even provided some guidance for revenue reductions. And so we anticipated that from that $53 million budget that we would have to cut $4.2 million. Fortunately, the things have not been as bad as we would have anticipated. Certainly revenues in a lot of areas are down, but in some areas not so much. I mean, in the recession from 2009, you could see that revenues over a period of about 2 budgets really declined across the board. And at least the experience we and other local governments have had is that during the pandemic, revenue declined in areas that were much more specific, such as meals and lodging tax. But those are not insignificant revenues for the city. And so in response, we proposed a number of actions to the council. And again, I know I'm repeating myself, but a number of these things were either things that we simply couldn't recommend that the council do on a regular basis because it would be financially unsound. For instance, the use of fund balance that it's not unusual that in the past that we've used some fund balance to balance the budget, but typically you're culling through an operational budget and picking items that are durable and that you could legitimately call capital and purchasing, whether it's vehicles or equipment or doing building maintenance, paying debt service and things like that. But we simply, plugged $500,000 of revenue stabilization and a $1.2 million fund balance plug against the operating budget. And that really is even contrary to the council's fund balance policy of using fund balance for recurring operational cost. But I think we all felt like, or at least the staff felt, and council adopted a budget that reflected our concern that we had to take pretty drastic measures in the face of extraordinary circumstances. In addition to that, from that $53 million budget, we reduced the wage compensation increases. We basically took VDOT revenues, the money that comes to us for road maintenance, and applied a portion of that to administrative overhead, which we're allowed to do in the VDOT system, but was something that was the first time in my experience that the city had done that. And the consequence is that's a $500,000 that doesn't go to road paving. And then we had almost $1 million of departmental reductions. We had furlough days built in, and as I say, we shorted the schools on their funding. So turning our attention to 2022 rather, and some of this information I think is familiar to you, but we talk a bit about where money comes from. And what you should see here is that really about 80% of the money, or $43 million or so that we spend in the general fund comes from local revenue sources, either property taxes or other types of sales and use taxes. About 16% of our budget, $9 million or so, comes in the form of state revenues. And a lot of those are either categorical, such as VDOT revenues that can only be used for road maintenance, or non-categorical aid from the state, aid to the police department or the public library, the support of constitutional officers. That federal grants make up other revenue sources. Typically, that's a small number, and we'll look at that more closely in a moment. In the past year, those numbers were larger because of the CARES Act funds that we received. And then other local revenues are the interfund transfers that we make. In other words, the water, sewer, refuse, stormwater divisions, enterprise divisions all pay the general fund for overhead administrative costs, things that they basically are paying for payroll and purchasing and the things that are provided from the general fund in their support. And then also fund balance transfers are reflected there. As we look to revenue trends, then and all of this information is available in your budget. I don't want to confuse matters, but the tables that we're going to go through in the slide presentation, again, are those comparisons between actual revenues that we created, money that we brought in FY 2020, to what the budget proposal is for FY 22. And again, the logic there is simply that we're trying to track known quantities. And as we look at 2021, those numbers look like that's a lot of additional revenue, but it's not. It's really a comparison to numbers where we were overly conservative in our estimates. And so that we can look at our revenues today and see that we'll be well above that $50 million projection for FY 2021. And so if you're really trending revenues and saying what's a realistic number, it's I think we're better served to make comparisons to 2020. Nonetheless, if you say, well, I want to compare 2022 to 2021, those numbers are in your budget book. And these tables that I'm going to show you reflect that change, and that the tables start on page 7. And then the detailed revenue, we have line item revenue that starts on page 10 of the budget book. Detailed expenditures start on page 58. But nonetheless, as we look at the changes in local revenues from 2021 actual collections to what we're proposing in 2022, the increase is about 2.7%. And we'll see that it's mostly on the strength of real property and the real estate reassessment. It's interesting to note, if the original city manager's budget from 2021 had held at $53 million, the increase from 21 to 22 would be about 2.7%. State revenues, which were actually in decline in 2021, rebound, but not quite to where we were in 2020. Federal revenue looks inflated in this graph at $1.1 million because we booked a portion of the first allotment of CARES money in fiscal year 2020. The rest of the CARES money will be booked in 2021. And so any of those dollars that are not expended by the end of the year will be booked against public safety salaries and fall to fund balance if there is a positive variance otherwise in the budget. I would, perhaps pause just briefly. I know that some councilmen and ladies are aware that we will receive additional funding through the next round of stimulus program from the federal government. At this point, we expect to receive a bit more than $4 million, but we've not received communication as to when we would receive those dollars or what restrictions will be placed on their use. And so you can't, because of governmental accounting, you can't book revenue that you either don't have in hand or don't have a commitment. So at this point, those numbers aren't reflected in our budget. At the point in time that we actually receive those funds, we bring appropriations to the council to appropriate them against specific uses. And those uses obviously will be defined by the federal government. But we've gotten, we certainly can look at some resources to see what the purpose of the money will be, but we don't know what specific restrictions for the use will be. And as you may recall, when we received the CARES funding, it was very restricted as to its use, and that, we were somewhat hamstrung. It wasn't a complete windfall. And then the interfund transfer, as I say, typically that's the funds that are coming over from the enterprise funds to pay for general fund expenditures for overhead cost. As you look at FY 2021, that $3.4 million also contains the $1.7 million of infusion from fund balance. And so you see it go back to $1.8 million, which is an increase from 2020 that is based on an overhead allocation study that we have conducted. So that we have a third-party auditor that periodically looks at our books and says these are legitimate numbers that you can charge for overhead, that it's an allocation that is based on real accounting.
Mr. Shaw,
Yes, sir.
can I ask a question?
Sure.
On this chart that you have up here now for FY 2021, the budget down at the bottom is $50,644,000.
Yes, sir.
And that's what we budgeted. And you just stated that we can't add in potential CARES money that we're going to be getting into this coming year.
Right.
Is that CARES money added into that total there of the 50 million point six?
No, sir. No, sir. That the CARES money you can see over in FY20 and that federal revenue line, that is, it's more than $1 million above FY20 and 22. Well, that in FY20 is CARES. So when we look back at 21, you'll see CARES money inflating FY21 as well. But to your specific question, no, that 50 doesn't include CARES money. That number, when we look at actuals, is going to go up. Not only because of CARES, but some of the other revenues were up also in 2021.
Well, I'm just, it would be helpful if that's what our budget was last year for that we're working on through the 2021 budget, correct?
Yes, sir.
And if in fact, when the day is done, we will have spent 54 million, whatever we received last year that
Right.
we spent, would help me understand how we spent that much last year in anticipation of what we're going to be spending in the coming year. Does that make sense to you?
It does make sense. It's a conversation that we've certainly had internally as we look at what's sort of left of the CARES, because as you're well aware, big chunks of CARES money went to economic development for small business and, to the Valley Community Service Board for the homeless and so forth. And so, there were expenditures booked against it, but there will be a net amount of that CARES money that we think will be holding. Now, it gets a little confusing. Let's say that we saved $1.7 million of our CARES money, and the federal government will allow us to say, well, you can book that against public safety salaries that you've already spent. So it's sort of, they'll repay us for that. And let's say it's $1.7 million, and don't get that number stuck in our heads, but hypothetically. Well, we started the year $1.7 million in the hole from fund balance. So you got to dig out of that hole before you can start to say, okay, well, it's real profit to us. And so we're trying we've looked at that quite a bit. Mr. McCormick keeps a running tally of CARES money spent, CARES money available. And if it's something that the council wants to dig into, then we can certainly do that.
Well, I'm trying not to make it more confusing. I'm trying to make it more plain to where I can understand. And when you say we dug into our reserve fund, we can't use the CARES money to replenish our or fund balance, can we?
Well, it will in a manner of speaking, because let's say we've already spent $1.7 million in public safety salaries, which the federal government says, well, that's a legitimate use of your CARES. Well, we're going to pay ourselves back from that from CARES. So now you're back to even there. And so it only becomes fund balance if, when the whole year is done, we can say all of our expenditures exceed all of our are less than all of our revenues. So if all of our revenue, CARES, and all of the other monies that we bring in are greater than what we've spent, then our fund balance will go up. And then you will see, as you look, if we look back at 2021, that CARES is going to be booked as a revenue. Whether it creates pure profit or not is yet to be seen.
But so if I understand, when you said we went into the reserves to kind of balance our budget last year,
Right.
but
Right.
we'll be able to use the CARES money to replenish that, what you say we dug a hole, we're filling the hole back up with that, correct?
That's our hope, yes.
Okay.
Yes. And our hope would be, and a little more. I think it's way early to tell. Usually people start asking us around July, do you think we made money this year? And we say we can't tell you that until the fall, until the books are all audited. But that's certainly our hope, is that we will, between some of our revenues, and we'll get into this in a second, I think some of our revenues are doing better than we had predicted with that $50 million budget anyway. And then you'll have CARES money also that's helping you plug a hole. We're still spending some of that CARES money down because we're still doing special cleaning with police cars and things like that. But a lot of the big expenditures, I think we've already taken.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. So then if we, focus a little more on just where does the general fund local revenue come from, that you'll see the real property, that's your real estate tax, comprises the biggest single source, and that's at 43% or so of our local revenue comes from the real estate tax. And I will readily concede that the real estate tax is a pretty uniformly, it's not a well-liked tax, but it is one of the most common forms of local government support here and elsewhere. And a lot of that is because it tends to be relatively stable compared to other types of taxes like meals tax or lodging tax, sales, things like that can fluctuate with the economy. So again, I recognize that it's not a particularly popular form of tax, but it's the most stable, and it's for most local governments, it's the biggest single source of revenue to support the general funds. In fact, that what I've seen over time, and it really was an effort that was even highlighted in our comp plan, was to become more dependent on real estate, because you can index it to sort of the things that that you have to provide. Across the state, on average, localities typically are collecting closer to 50%, 48% or so, I think is sort of a most recent number I looked at for cities. Ours at 43 is, I think we're heading in the right direction if you want to look at it that way. Beyond real estate, then here in Waynesboro, we are pretty dependent on what are listed here as miscellaneous local taxes, which, that's almost $7 million, 15% or 16%. And the biggest chunk of that would be your meals tax and your lodging taxes combined, and then some other taxes. Sales tax is big here. I mean, we've gotten to be about $5.6 million of our budget is based on sales tax. Other property taxes, which are the things like personal property, motor vehicles, business personal property, machinery tools are also significant for us. Let's go to the next slide, Mr. McCormick, and we'll look at this a little more in detail. So I think it's clear that a lot of the story of this year's budget is the real estate reassessment. And I think, as Mr. Hamp alluded, that the real estate market has been pretty healthy here, locally, especially the housing market. You have a lot of turnover, a lot of demand, and so values go up. And we're required by law to assess according to, real property value. In fact, the state comes in and audits to see that we do that. So those aren't inflated or artificial. They're based on real sales. And that's really where you see the greatest growth in our budget. Now, that $18,700,000 number there for fiscal year 2022 includes the value of the reassessment, and it also includes new development or new improvements that have come online, new construction, which is a little more than $200,000. It also includes some money there that are collections on delinquent prior year's taxes, about $150,000 or so. So if you take all that together, that increase from where we were in 2020 and really pretty closely to 2021, it didn't drop off much. So to say you don't see much fluctuation in real property taxes. That increased about 10%. Now, that isn't necessarily the increase to every individual property owner, and I think that's a key point to be made, that the individual property owner would have to look at the reassessment notice that came from the commissioner to see what their increase, assessment value is. And then personal property taxes, those are the business personal property as well as motor vehicles. If we're looking to, back to 2020, they're actually down a little bit. Some of that has to do with the commissioners has made some changes in her methods of assessment for those types of properties. Other property taxes are the machinery tool tax, rolling stock, which again, down a little bit. Some of those are based on depreciation values, and so if you're not adding new equipment, then you see the effect of depreciation. Penalties and interest on taxes, again, they kind of track along with where your taxes are overall. So if you look at all of your general property taxes from 2022 from 2020 to 2022, the increase is about $1.6 million or 6.9%. If you said, I just want to compare it to 2021, well, then obviously it's a little bigger number than that. It's probably more like about 11% increase. All right, sir. So these are smaller dollars, but nonetheless, we take the, all of the revenue, great and small, and so regulatory permits, building permits, those kinds of things are down a little bit from where we were in 2020, up from 2021. Other miscellaneous local revenues are going to increase about $30,000. Charges for services are down a bit. A lot of that has to do with parks and recreation activity. And then other miscellaneous revenues, a lot of those are proceeds that we get from either insurance, rental of city properties, and that sort of thing. This is a significant decrease from 2020 to 2022, but that's primarily because we don't budget insurance proceeds or special court collections and things like that. Those are not things that we count on, and so you'll see it that sometimes the budget looks much higher than we're predicting, but it's because we don't anticipate how much we might get from insurance proceeds or as I say, the collections. We certainly budget court collections, but there are certain types of court collections that we don't count on. Mr. McCormick, I think, is going to start to take us through now how we use our revenues. I hope that I've covered where our revenues come from and how we came to the conclusion for the budget that we are proposing to you. Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Shaw. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of council. As Mr. Shaw alluded to, my hope is to take you all through the expenditure side of your general fund budget. One of the things that you'll hear me refer to a couple of different times is local. What percentage of your budget is actually going towards things that are here that you control and have a varying degree of control on, but more control than the other pieces of this pie graph. This isn't a technical term that you're finding in your budget. It's more of a group of different items like your local public works, your general government administration, like your city manager's department, your assessor's department, your finance department, your other internal services, your parks and rec, your community development, some things like that. And then the biggest piece of this local being your public safety. So you won't hear, that's not a technical term. That's just a grouping of a couple of different things that we'll go into a little bit deeper as we move through the next couple of slides. And so as Mr. Hamp alluded to, the city's taxing authority for a number of other entities, approximately 59%, which is this piece of the pie over here, of your $32 million of the $54 million budget presented goes to other entities or is funded by a discrete funding source such as a grant or state funding. State offices such as the courts, Commonwealth Attorney, Commissioner of Revenue, Treasurer, Sheriff, and the Registrar make up 5%. The yearly debt service of about $3.2 million makes up 6%. Interjurisdictional and grant funded items such as the Victim Witness Program, highway maintenance, animal shelter, correction and detention, and the Office on Youth make up about 17% of the city's general fund. And the school funding formula comprises about 31%, or the school funding support comprises about 31% of the local budget. So as you move around the pie graph from here to here, your ability or council's ability to control these expenditures varies from very little, such as your yearly debt service and state offices, for which the comp board mostly funds state offices, and your debt service is predicated based on an amortization schedule, to pretty substantial for most of the local expenditures. It should be noted that even some local expenditures, the city receives categorical funding from the state, such as library and police funding. So the next few slides are just going to focus on this 41% piece of the pie. So local expenditures make up about $22.4 million of your $54 million budget, or 41%. This graph represents the percentage of that $22.4 million that is allocated towards salaries and benefits and non-salaries and benefits. So approximately 72% of the $22.4 million is allocated towards salaries. The other 28% is allocated towards non-personnel expenditures such as utilities, software maintenance, capital transfers, and legal services. So this is kind of what you use it for. And then the next slide is the same $22.4 million. It's just cut a little bit differently. And this is the who uses it. So almost half of the city's local expenditures go towards public safety. Those are things like fire, police, EOC, building and zoning. The next largest category is general government. General government includes things like your assessor, IT, city manager's office, finance, insurance, attorney fees, and HR. It's worth noting that while your general government is classified as fully local here, it manages much more than just the local budgets and assists with things like enterprise fund support and grant compliance. So it looks a little large here, but it helps assist all of those internal services help assist all of your enterprise funds and all of those other things that are represented in the bigger $55 million budget and the other enterprise funds. Next largest category is public works. It should be noted that this includes things like engineering, the local landfill, and the public works administration office. It does not include the enterprise fund and the highway maintenance. The highway maintenance would be included in this interjurisdictional and grant because it has to be spent on highway maintenance eligible activities. And then the final activity or final category of other includes things like planning, economic development, and tourism. So the next slide I have are your base expenditure changes. So a more detailed slide of what went up. The school's increase is dictated by the funding formula and is set at almost $1.4 million increase over the base of last year. There's a 3% raise program for the full year that will cost close to $500,000 once benefits are considered. Correction and detention, which includes your juvenile detention center and jail, is currently projected to increase about $300,000. It's worth noting that neither of those budgets have been adopted yet, so those numbers are conservative and may change some over the next couple of weeks. The police and fire increase is mostly due to the raises given mid-year in the police department, as well as leasing some space for the fire department for a continued second station next year. Health insurance for the second half of the year is estimated to go up about 10%. So we adopt health insurance rates based on the calendar year, not the fiscal year. So for the first half of this coming fiscal year, we'll have to budget a little bit more than for last year because we adopted a higher rate during the beginning or during this calendar year. And then for next year, our consultants have told us that health insurance costs will go up about 10%. The funds budgeted here cover both the employee and the employer portion of that increase. There are some things that went up that aren't mentioned here. As Mr. Shaw noted, we did use some of the cost allocation plan to take credit for some VDOT expenditures. It ultimately reduces your paving, and it's not a practice that we would generally suggest outside of a pandemic or something out of the ordinary coming up. We also had furlough days programmed for this year that we had to recover from as well. And then finally, there are a few new positions budgeted for approximately $128,000 in total, which are detailed on the next slide. So 3 full-time positions. The building and zoning has seen a pretty large increase in workload and permit requests. So there's a permit technician being recommended for the second half of the year. 2 new Utility 1 positions are being recommended. These are a little bit unique and are listed here, but they're actually mostly offset by your Middle River Regional Jail work crew. Due to the pandemic and over the past few years, Middle River has struggled to provide crews. So in reviewing that arrangement, it's determined that it would likely be more beneficial to no longer use a jail crew in an attempt to hire for those positions. And those positions are all also funded partially out of the enterprise funds, partially out of highway maintenance. So the piece that the local funds bear on that isn't significant once you consider all those factors. There are also 4 new part-time positions being recommended. The senior IT systems analyst will assist IT department with munis projects and training. The CIT coordinator is another position that's funded from a couple of different sources. It's shared between the city, Stanton, and Augusta County. The ADA coordinator is a position being recommended so that one person could take on the federal responsibilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the office manager position in EOC is to take some administrative responsibility and burden off of the EOC director so that he can focus on more operational tasks. The next list is the positions requested but not funded. We had a number of positions requested by various departments that are not being recommended in this budget. They tend to focus around communication and public safety, and all have professional or operational justification but are not able to be supported with the current revenue stream. And then lastly are the uses of fund balance that we went through to balance the budget. So every year we go through and see if there's anything that's capital in nature, one-time, non-recurring in nature that would perhaps be a candidate for use of fund balance. Depending on where all of these land, we'll bring a budget amendment at some point before the end of the year to take care of these items. Some of the items, or the main 2, are your early debt reduction. So your 2001A bond, The last year of amortization on that is in 2022. So it is eligible for use to be paid off out of fund balance, and it'll keep you from having to pay that debt payment fully from local revenue. Paying it out of local fund balance will keep that expenditure from weighing on this year. The offset to that is you don't get the advantage of it organically falling off next year. Your police department vehicles, that's budgeted for 3 new vehicles. That doesn't include the take-home cars. That's only maintenance vehicles for vehicles that the chief has deemed needs to be swapped out. You have some general vehicles that are in line to be upgraded and traded out. Equipment and miscellaneous repairs, those are some various items, some building maintenance. The ops lot probably needs repaving, and then a 911 logging upgrade for $28,000. And those are the last things that I have on the expenditure side. If anybody has any questions on the expenditure side or just in general, be happy to field them now.
Cameron, it's Terry. If you could ask, speak a little bit of the use of fund balance for the explain the $253,000 in early debt payment or early debt reduction and why we would do that.
So if you pay the full amount out of right now, I think that the amortization schedule for all of your debt for your payments for next year is about $3.5 million. If you pay off the 2001A bond early using fund balance, it'll decrease that number to about 3.3, and so that way you don't have to find those funds during the current year. You can take those funds and use them somewhere else by replacing them with fund balance funds.
Great, thank you. Is it now an appropriate time to ask a combination of you and Jim unpacked a lot of stuff there. I know we want to entertain questions now or otherwise. Well, one thing that I thought about in light of recent conversations, is there any need to have any discussion about fiscal planning beyond a June 30th, 2022 date? Considering any conversations, it's too early to discuss whether or not we would entertain a fiscal year change to January 1.
For what purpose?
Well, some communities are because of the elections and the changing of elections and new start dates of councils to January 1. There's been some conversation in other communities that are going to be affected by this. With elections moving to November and then new officers taking office in January, there has been some conversation across the state about some communities are considering changing their fiscal year. I just wanted to, it made me think of it when y'all were talking. Not on the radar or a need?
I think that's said legislatively, and we would need to look and see if we had the authority to do so.
Okay. That's all I have for the slides right now.
So as far as next steps go, on April the 6th, that's tomorrow evening, we'll talk about the capital improvement plan and the enterprise fund presentation. We'll make an enterprise fund presentation for the water, sewer, stormwater, refuse funds. Then on April the 12th, we're to hold a reassessment public hearing, and we'll hold that at the high school and the auditorium there. And it is a requirement of law that if your total taxable value increases by more than, I think it's 1.1%, then you have to have a reassessment public hearing, and you have to advertise what the rate would be, the tax rate would be to collect the same amount of money prior to the reassessment. And so we've advertised the 83-cent equalized tax rate for that public hearing. And then we'll ask the council to schedule public hearings to be able to introduce various ordinances. There's the tax ordinance and all of the utility fee ordinances, and then the budget ordinance itself. So I think that's our presentation. I think now would be a certainly appropriate time to field questions from the council, or if it's your pleasure to have some conversation. I think staff's concluded its presentation for the evening.
And am I correct that all the figures we saw tonight was based on a 90 cents tax evaluation, right? Not 83?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
I actually had a question about the, sorry, that's my clock again. All right, about the increase in the school funding and what that budget looks like, and reminding us sort of what that's based on and what their budget looked like last year, in terms of what piece that plays.
I'll throw out broad numbers, and maybe as I talk, Mr. McCormick can pull up something more exact. We do have a trend, but the school funding formula identifies specific discretionary revenues that will be used to apply to the formula, and then 42.5% of those revenues go to the schools. And so this year, the increase, would be, approximately $1.3 million increase over previous year, bearing in mind that last year we reduced school funding by almost $500,000. So in terms of a real outlay, some might look at it and say it's an $800,000 increase. In terms of formula to formula, it's an $800,000 increase. And we have sent CARES money to the schools this year, that we provided them some of the CARES money that we received. And, but as I say, the real increase to the schools is about $1.3 million, a little bit more, based on the 42.5% of specific discretionary revenues.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
I have a quick question. If you have the slideshow, if you wouldn't mind kind of bringing that back up. There's a couple of things caught my attention. There was a slide where you discussed about what we withheld because of anticipating COVID implications. Right, I think it was early on in the slide deck. So eliminate 3% raise and comp study implementation, $354,000. Now, if you advance a few slides to what's included in terms of expenditures, it's just the 3% raise, not compensation plan implementation, and that now figure is risen to $478,000. And that's only the 3% raise. Could you explain that a little bit, of how it was 354 when we banked it last year in anticipation of implications of COVID, and how it's risen to 478 with only the 3% raise?
So last year when we calculated those figures, we did them on a half year, not on a full year. So it was two phases of the comp study and a 3% raise based on a half year, and that's a 3% raise. Based on a full year, based on a half year is a little bit easier to do on a not reassessment year, because you're most likely not going to have as much organic revenue growth in a non-reassessment year. So if you're going to do a half or a quarter or a third, you usually try to do that on your off years, where if you don't have a reassessment coming up, you try to do it for the full year so it doesn't burden on your next year if you possibly can.
Yeah, that makes sense. I kind of anticipated that, but I also anticipated I might get that question. So that's good to throw that out there.
Sure.
Could you speak a little bit to what would the debt service hypothetically be on a new $4 million debt issuance?
Give me 1 second. So assuming a 3% interest rate over 20 years or over 30 years on $4 million, I'm sure this makes, because your last issuance was about $20 million for the high school, and the debt payment on that is about $1.4 million. So that is coming up with about $205,000. $205,000.
So the question I have is, and I recognize that this will be a conversation for tomorrow night, but you guys snuck it in there for tonight, so I thought I would make a reference to it. That $900,000, I think I heard $900,000 set aside in the CIP for the West End Fire Station, right? And so my question is that to maybe kind of walk through the narrative of if we banked the $900,000 into debt service, long-term debt service, went into the bond market, borrowed $4 million, we could not just construct the fire station, we could also finish Sunset Park at a $205,000 3% interest rate and we would already have the money actually set aside in a bank account for the next three and a half fiscal years. You could essentially accomplish all of the three things to a degree without any adjustments into the rate. We could make a good faith effort of a 3% pay raise. We could advance full construction, design and construction placement of the Weston Fire Station, and we could finish Sunset Park using just the $900,000 and looking at that. I'm just throwing it out as an idea. I mean, we don't have to talk about it tonight, but I thought it's an observation that that would be a way to do it and accomplish those three. Because I think it's, at the same time is we all have those experiences where we're out there, we're talking to folks, they're calling us, and they're going to see an increase in their valuation, but they're keeping their house, so they're going to get a bigger bill. And so while compensation is warranted and needed for our employees, showing where their investments are going and seeing tangible physical product of their investments, I think are also important. And this could be a way to through a very nominal debt issuance to accomplish it. Recognizing that too, I know because I've had lots of conversations with Jim over the years about if you're going to go issue debt, you want to make sure that you have long-term revenue streams in order to satisfy that debt. But I use the case in point of that we do this all the time, right? With doing half-year positions, I've even seen quarter-year positions where we are hoping and praying that we have a healthy fund balance to roll in that fund balance to accomplish general fund expenditures in the following year. But that's really not all that, I mean, that's probably going to happen. But in terms of a matter of practice, I mean, I like seeing that we're going to do 3% day one for the employees, and it's just realistic, because I think it's a little cat and mouse a little bit to just do half year, quarter years, because you're going to get the full load when we're here next year talking about the same thing. We would have realized that the full thing. So right, so that's my soapbox thing for the night, but that's all I had.
But I might offer
Just to re-
Who's speaking? Mr.
Did you have
Shaw.
something, Mr.
I'm going to butt in here. I'm just going to say that, you know, if we end up with a 7-cent tax increase, 7-cent amount, then next year when we're having that discussion, we're going to be losing 40.5% of it because that'll be going to the school, correct?
It would hit
It would take 2 years, Mr. Shaw.
following. Yeah, 2 years. But yes, you have to look at it and say that 42.5% of whatever that new revenue will ultimately be owed to the schools, because real estate is part of that discretionary revenue in the formula. So yes, that is correct.
Just like for everybody to remember, anytime we do an increase of that amount, good for this coming budget, but then following budgets, that money's going to disappear. And the other thing is, you know, at our last meeting, we talked about wanting to have the information at a 83-cent tax rate, and what that would mean as far as our budget, what we would lose. And we don't have that information tonight, correct, Mr. Ham?
That's correct, Mr. Allen.
And are we going to get that information before we move forward with our next meetings and whatnot?
So let me respond to Terry's observation. Let me add something to that, his comment, and then can I come back to your question, Mr. Allen?
Yes, sir.
So I fear that I may have missed the mark in my message. And one of the messages that I'm trying to impart to council is that really, as a manager, we feel stress, or I feel stress, and I think that's shared by the executive staff, of being able to meet the basic needs of core services. And so if I think about the opportunity to borrow funds, I think not just about things that we might want to do, but I think oftentimes first about things that either we'll need to do or that we are expected to do. And so you have the possibility of an expansion of a correctional facility, which you would be obligated to participate in. You have a second phase of Waynesboro High School renovation, which I think whether you view that as an obligation, a commitment you've made, or whether there's a community expectation in that regard, that has to be factored into what you might borrow money for. I would say in confession that a recent history with facilities such as bridges is not great, that to some level we don't carry enough cash capacity to execute either emergency repair, restoration, or emergency replacement without the facility being out of service for some time. And so it comes to the question of what kind of city do you want to be? And you certainly, the council makes that ultimate decision, as I suggested. So you could borrow money and finish Sunset Park, but I think it would be incumbent upon me to impress upon you what other needs you would soon confront, or what other opportunities might compete legitimately with that opportunity. Mr. Allen, with respect to 83 cents, Cameron, can you go back to the slide deck? I'm going to give you, I don't want to seem evasive, and I don't want to leave the impression that I didn't hear or intend to attend to the expressed desire by council to understand what 83 cents might mean. But I will furnish tonight a general answer and then work toward a more specific answer. And that would be, you know, a second theme of this presentation is the measure of discretion and authority that a local body enjoys or exercises over its budget. And so part of the message tonight has been in a $50 or $54 million budget, the council has varying levels of authority or discretion. If we consider where you have the most authority and discretion, it would be in either of the two blue pie sections, the local 41% or the school funding 31%. And I think in order to demonstrate or illustrate what an 83 tax an 83-cent tax rate might mean to the budget and the community, the solution lies in those two sections of your pie. And I think it involves most certainly management of labor expense and management of school support. And I think I'll stop there and give you sort of, that's the general direction that as a manager, I would suggest we start that you would need to explore in order to achieve 83 cents. And again, I apologize if I left the council with the impression that that I either was hard of hearing or inattentive. That was not my intention. But I think typically, it takes us about 3 months to build a budget on sort of the recommended tax rate. And in the past, Mr. Allen is right. We have been able to develop sort of alternative considerations, alternative plans or options. And generally, we've supplied that information in subsequent work session meetings. So, Mr. Allen, I hope that's perhaps not the complete answer you would expect, but a satisfactory answer for this evening.
It is for this evening.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
I think just to carry on with a piggyback on that to just a little bit. I mean, I think if we're going to work in hypotheticals, I mean, I would be interested to know. Again, we've had our community has had 2 exhaustive compensation plan interviews with our staff, many in our staff, twice now over the last decade, and we've not been able to fulfill those commitments or conversations about needs and competitiveness for either of those cases. And so here we are in a position where I'm grateful I got my second vaccine. I think, and I encourage other folks that might be listening to go get their vaccines. And we may not be at the end of the tunnel, but the light is there. We saw recently the state with a significant infusion of cash balance for the end of their fiscal year of about $1 billion. We see unemployment in our community, one of the lowest that it's been in some time. And I think from a competitive standpoint of where our economy, our local economy has been, it's been resilient. I think to the greatest extent that you can be in COVID. I think we see that with how our conservative, and I'm appreciative of our conservative estimates moving into this year, gratefully did not come to full fruition. I'm grateful for that. But I offer those as examples of, those are examples of a sound local economy, a sound growing local economy. Folks are choosing Waynesboro because I think in part, not only to its affordability, but our commitments of who we are and our identity. I think people buy homes, choose places to send their children to school at because of the identity of that community. And I look at things that we chatted about in the comprehensive plan. Again, over 200 people participating in, and I go back to employee compensation, and I would be interested to know, what would it cost? What would the rate have to be above and beyond the 90-cent rate? And again, we're dealing in hypotheticals to implement at a minimum the first phase 1 of the compensation plan. Given the circumstances. Again, I think we've heard this evening of the number of additional peripheral expenses that we don't have a choice in, that we're absorbing, that we have to absorb. But with not, again, I know our employees will be appreciative of the 3% raise, but again, it doesn't sit well with me that we're kind of kicking the can again for another year. So I think if we're going to look at it, we might as well look at a minimum what that would cost.
and I'd probably respond, it doesn't sit well with me that we continue to spend more money than we have coming in. And the only real recourse other than development, and I'm kind of proud of the development that we've had in the last couple of years, what we've had out on Windy Road, what we've had up off of Bellevue and Forest Avenue, and what's going on over at Hannah Marie and across the street, close to Holtman Parkway. I mean, we're having a lot of development, and I understand, and I'm not deaf to anything we hear that as we see the slides, the cost of the jail and the cost of social services seem like they're outgrowing us faster than we're growing. But once again, people that I talk to, and I'm not talking to everybody, but just in the places and businesses I go to, they're not having the substantial growth and development and getting to the point where we would all like to be at. And, you know, I agree with Mr. Short in what we want our community to be, but I'm personally proud of where we've came in the last 14 or 15 years, and with the infrastructure and trying to work on compensation and trying to give raises. And I know there's been times we wanted to give more, but we did give something. I'm not proud to say that we're where we're at with our compensation, but I sleep well at night when I say that, you know, we've put up what we could with what we've had coming in. And sure, we could raise the tax rate to 95 cents, and we could have more money to work on projects that we all hold dear to us. But I just don't feel like that a lot of our constituents and businesses, they would be as happy with that as the end result. And you know, when we still look at some of the factories and industries, you know, in Waynesboro that are laying off or cutting back, and instead of growing and expanding, that comes into play, and where we're going to be at 12 or 24 months from now, which none of us know. We're all hoping that things are going to be in a positive note and that our country will move forward. But I get cautious when I step out on ice. That's all I'll say tonight. Thank you.
Anyone else have anything you want to share tonight? All right, Mike, what do you guys have anything else for us?
So let me, if I could, Mr. Mayor, touch base with Mr. Sanders, whether or not there are, by chance, any speakers in the queue.
Mr. Hamp, I don't believe we have public comment advertised for the evening.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Shaw. In that case, Mr. Henderson, that's all we have prepared. I appreciate the council's time, and I appreciate that we have another meeting scheduled for tomorrow evening, and encourage you to come back and hear some additional information and come prepared to offer feedback. We appreciate it very much.
That gives us 24 hours to look over this thick document you sent us tonight.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Oh, would you all mind sending us a copy of the PowerPoint presentation for this evening?
Happy we can do that. Yes, sir.
Sure. Absolutely.
Thank you all.
Good night, everybody.
All right.
Thank you.
Good night.
Have a good 20.